That's dark. I love it. Welcome to A Century in Cinema. I'm Arthur.
And I'm Andrew.
And this is a podcast where we discuss a classic film from every year, starting in 1920. Today's film is from 1923, Harold Lloyd's Safety Last. And where can people find Safety Last if they want to watch it?
So Safety Last is available on the Criterion channel, as well as HBO Max, as well as some of Harold Lloyd's other shorts from around that time.
And Safety Last is also a public domain film, so I think you can just find it around online.
That's the best part about these early movies, is that they're pretty much all public domain.
So this little first section of the podcast where I always go through like world history and what's going on in the year, I do feel obligated to apologize because I am inevitably going to miss big things like there's a civil war happening in Ireland, and I just completely forgot to mention that last week. So all I can do is try to keep it relevant to what the film is for the week, or if it is like a really, really big world event, or if it's just interesting to us. Like, for instance, 1923 is when Warner Brothers is formed. One of the biggest Hollywood studios is put together and joins the scene. In Germany, Hitler leads the Nazi Party in a failed coup. It's also the year of the Great Kanto earthquake in Japan. I know that Akira Kurosawa lived through that, and I remember reading that in his autobiography that it made a huge impression on him.
I didn't even know about that.
Kurosawa is one of my favorite directors, if not my favorite director. I just adore everything that he's done.
Yeah, he's definitely up there for me as well. I don't think he quite edges out Kieslowski for me, but he's definitely up there.
Yeah, none of that's super relevant to Safety Last. Do you want to talk a little bit about the plot of this film? It's pretty short. It's only 74 minutes.
Yeah, it's a very short film. Pretty much Harold Lloyd is playing himself. Actually, little trivia fact, this is the only film where his character's name is Harold Lloyd. In every other film, it's Harold something, or it's just Harold, or it could even have been the guy with the glasses at some points. But in this film, he receives a ticket and a paycheck that has the name Harold Lloyd on it. So this is the only film where his character's name is Harold Lloyd. And he works for a clothing company. He works on the main floor. He has a woman who he's in love with and is trying to convince that he's a higher-up CEO. Shenanigans ensue. One thing leads to another. He has to do a publicity stunt to create a marketing ploy and ends up climbing up the side of a building. The original plan is to get this other guy to climb it and make it look like it's him, but the other guy gets chased by the cops. So Harold himself is forced to climb the building. It's a very thrilling sequence. There's not much in the way of a plot here, honestly. It's more set piece to set piece from the very beginning. But it's so entertaining.
I feel like a lot of early silent film comedies are basically set pieces strung together by a very loose plot.
Yes. This is a very loose plot. I don't have much else to add as for the plot.
I mean, yeah, he's just trying to impress his fiancée and convince her that he has more money than he does, and in order to do that, he's forced to engage in a publicity stunt for the clothing company he works at and climb this big building. And that's basically, it feels like the entire film is a little bit of an excuse to just get to that last set piece.
Yeah, and it's because his boss says that he'll give $1,000 to somebody who can get more people to come to the store, and then he tells them about the building, and the boss is not into it, but agrees to it when he says he'll do it for $500.
What was your favorite scene watching this film?
Pretty much just the opening just destroyed me. Like, I'd kind of forgotten how funny that is. I've seen that building sequence so many times. But, I don't know, just the gags outside of that, oh my gosh, the shot of him and his housemate in the jackets hanging themselves up on the wall and curling up into the wall. That is so funny. Like, that made me laugh.
To hide from the landlord? I loved that.
Yes. And then he wants to eat by himself while the guy's there, so he pretends to knock on the door, and the other guy hangs himself up, and he just, eats while he's still hanging there. Yeah, that huge crowd of people all screaming for fabric, and he says, "Who dropped that $50 bill?" And everyone drops except for the old woman, who he's able to like finish his transaction with so she can leave, and then they all pop back up together. Hilarious.
My favorite cut was when it looks like he's being beaten on the street, like in a back alley, and then the camera just like pans out and zooms a little bit, and you see that it's all of these like old women just trying to get his attention in the supermarket.
Yes. Yeah, there was a lot to like in this movie. It's very quickly paced. It's very funny. It's very short. It sort of encapsulates that whole mood of that silent comedy in a really nice way. I don't want to call it nostalgia, but I guess that's kind of what it is. Just this feeling of like, this is what comedies were always intended to be. Like these sweet, innocent things that just have these super minor, low stakes conflicts that lead to these super high stakes consequences and like set pieces. It's so funny.
I had actually seen the last act or reel of this film before. I mean, it's such a famous scene of Harold Lloyd climbing the building. There's plenty to like throughout the film, and that was all fun to see for the first time. But watching the last act is still pretty great. I was so anxious the whole time. It was like watching Free Solo again. Just hands were sweating. You can feel the terror from Harold Lloyd the entire time. And even though it's like 7 minutes, it's not that long. It feels so much longer. What did you think of it?
I mean, I've seen it so many times. I still think it's super impressive. Looking more into it, though, for the purposes of this podcast was super fascinating. Almost all of it was filmed on 2 different streets, and you can actually see it when you watch it again, that the backdrop of the streets behind him changes.
Okay, that got a laugh out of me because I thought it was just accentuating the idea that as he climbs, he keeps like entering different ecosystems of the city, that he keeps seeing more and more of it.
Yeah. And it's also incredible because outside of the first 2 levels, which you see him climb up from the street, it's almost all done on this wall that they had on top of a roof. Still super scary. There were no guardrails or anything. All they had was a mattress underneath him. The pictures of this set are crazy. The mattress is like a quarter of the way off the side of the building. And it looks very much like if he were to fall off and hit that mattress, he would just bounce right off and go off the side of the building.
So are you saying that it wasn't rear projection? I assumed it was.
No, it's not rear projection. That's a real street behind him. He's on a big building that they've built on top of a big building.
Wow. That's cool.
So it's also really incredible because one of the ways they went about doing this, Bill Strother, who within the film plays Bill, who is a guy who he pays to climb the building for him before he starts getting chased by the cops and then he's forced to climb the whole building himself. Mm-hmm. That man actually was known for climbing buildings with no harnesses or anything.
Oh, he's like infamous back in the day.
Yeah, he was a guy who would climb buildings and stuff. And so Harold Lloyd found him and was like, hey, we want like a stunt coordinator and someone who could like help us. And he was like, actually, we should just put you in the movie. And that was how it went from being... because it was originally just a straight gag of like, okay, I've got to do this publicity stunt. I'm going to climb this building. And that whole subplot of him finding the drunk guy and being like, you could do it for me and all that. That was all added in because they were like, we should get this guy in the movie. So Bill, the character in the film, is an actual building climber from that time period.
Does anything feel out of date in this film?
I want to say his whole like plot of pretending to have too much money and stuff feels so of that time period, but people do still do that stuff.
That sort of fake it till you make it comedy.
Yeah. Anything that feels out of date. Yeah, I have no idea.
Yeah, I don't know if it's out of date, but it was cool to see like a big city setting from this time period. So many of the films we've watched recently, you know, like The Phantom Carriage and Within Our Gates, especially Nanook of the North, have all been, you know, isolated or on sets. So it was just cool to see what actual big city looked like from the mid-1920s.
Yeah, it was actually on this hill in Los Angeles And this hill doesn't exist anymore. It's all been leveled now. But on this hill, they would film so many films because it gave you a really good perspective of the city and made it look like the city was sprawling behind you pretty much wherever you shot on it. And they shot so many films on that hill. But I also, this... I feel like I'm bad at this section of the review, but I also, like, don't know if I saw anything in here that was, like, super ahead of its time. So interesting, though, there's been recent discussions of how comedy is the quickest genre to age poorly, and jokes, like, struggle to stay relevant over time. And then you watch, like, the first full-length comedy film, and you're like, this is still funny. This is still hilarious. There's something universal about the comedy in Safety Last, and the comedy itself isn't based in any, like, current cultural phenomenon. It isn't based in current politics. It isn't based in something that is exclusive to 1923. It's based around watching this guy flip around up and down and fall off things, and it's still funny to watch that.
But I've heard plenty of people say that, yeah, that, like, comedies just... they look at something from the 1980s and they're like, well, of course it's not funny, like, doesn't age well.
Yeah, the 90s too. It seems like comedy in the 90s, when it was really going for, like, shock value and kind of gross out gags and mocking people. It seems to be a huge thing in the 90s of comedy and the early 2000s, and that has not really aged well at all anyway.
You said you watched this with your mom last week, and it's like a palate cleanser for other more dour movies.
It was right after we watched In Cold Blood, a very dark film about the negative effect of the death penalty in America. And it ends with a very graphic hanging scene. And it's still, to this day, very impactful and very intense. And the reason why this story will always stick with me is because neither of us had seen Safety Last, and my mom was insistent that we watch something fun, something light, something that was a comedy. And I was like, well, I also have this movie that I haven't seen yet that I know is very funny and light. And the opening gag of Safety Last is him behind these bars with what you think is a noose behind him. And we were both just like, our jaws just dropped. And I was like, oh man, like, what's going to happen in this thing? And then, of course, the gag is that it's just a train stop and that's just a train post. And it's just framed to make it look like he's behind bars with a noose behind him. And it's just such a funny gag. And you add that to this crazy coincidence on top of what we had just watched. And we were laughing so hard at that reveal. And yeah, we were pretty much completely enthralled and entertained from that point forward. It was a great viewing experience.
I know a lot of people who watch films and go to the movies, but not that many people who are into silent films. The exception being Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton, which I can usually use to convince people that, no, silent films are worth your time. You are going to enjoy this. So I feel like silent era comedies are almost like a way in for people who aren't as accustomed to this era of cinema. Have you felt that way too?
Yeah, and I would say Harold Lloyd doubly so, because they all have their gimmick, right? Charlie Chaplin is like this like silent fool who like is constantly bumbling around, and Buster Keaton is sort of this more dour, like he's like this mysterious figure. But Harold Lloyd is like, his whole approach was that he was the everyman, he's like this regular dude. They all three end up using those character forms to kind of create these hijinks and like create these comedies. But Harold Lloyd is the one that's like, you're supposed to feel like you relate to that guy. It's not supposed to feel like you're watching a movie star on screen as much as it is you thinking, oh, wow, this is like kind of a relatable situation with these relatable emotions. And then you sort of feel like it's you climbing up the building, which makes the tension even more intense. And Charlie Chaplin gets a lot of credit for being one of like the first international film stars, if not considered the first international film star. But what's wild is that Harold Lloyd made more films than Chaplin during that period of time, and also had more financial success. But somehow Chaplin kind of gets that credit over him. So I've always thought that was kind of interesting, because Harold Lloyd, honestly, it's just within culture is nowhere near as well known of a name as Buster Keaton or Charlie Chaplin. But he really should be, because his movies are just as good and he was working just as hard. And I would say that his comedies hold up almost better than some of the Chaplin and Keaton ones do.
Yeah, I don't want to like disparage Chaplin and Buster Keaton. I love those two filmmakers, but exactly what you said. I was actually telling someone that I was watching this film, and I described the last set piece where Harold Lloyd's hanging off the clock, and they were like, "Oh, that Charlie Chaplin film." I'm like, "No, it's someone else." But they're like, "No, it's Charlie Chaplin hanging off the clock, right?" In their mind, they just knew this was a Charlie Chaplin film.
Yeah. And that's weird too. I've actually had that conversation concerning the Young Sherlock Holmes, the Buster Keaton film, where someone was like, "Oh yeah, that Chaplin movie," and I was like, "No." Like, it's just so funny that people think there was only one guy doing silent comedies at this time period. And you know what? That's not entirely their fault, because that's sort of Chaplin is just like sort of taught. I know this is a little silly, but I truly do think it's in the slick alliteration of his name. Like, it's so catchy, and I think that you say that and people grasp onto it, and people associate, okay, Charlie Chaplin with this era of silent comedies, and therefore they don't really know what this silent comedy is actually about, and they're like, Charlie Chaplin.
I still love so many of Chaplin's films. If I hadn't seen so many of them, I'm sure one of them would have made it onto our list of films to watch. In my mind, he has that image of the tramp. Everyone knows the tramp.
Yeah.
He embodies the underdog and the downtrodden in society. I think of Modern Times, and I think of City Lights, where he plays an immigrant. So it's someone that you kind of feel bad for.
The Gold Rush is another one.
Oh, yeah.
That, like, I really feel for his character. It's such a funny scene where he eats the shoe, but you also, like, are watching this guy eat a shoe. And you just feel so bad for him.
And it's that juxtaposed with, like, his gracefulness. Like, he's always in his dusty suits and everything, but he's such, like, a beautiful dancer in all of his films. And so that's how I remember Chaplin. And I always remember Buster Keaton because he has such a fascination with, like, cinema and movies. Have you seen Sherlock Jr.?
No, I have not. I've seen the infamous theater jumping sequence, but I've never actually sat down and watched the whole film.
Like in Sherlock Jr., he clearly is enamored with how he can use cutting and framing to get a laugh. So that's how I know those two. But then Harold Lloyd, I've only seen this film from Harold Lloyd, Safety Last. What is he really known for and embodying as a comedian from this time period?
Well, I think it really is supposed to be just your working middle class man who is trying to put things together, putting on this, air of having some sort of status and being in some way better off than he actually is, and having to suffer kind of greatly because of these lies that he's telling to get himself out. Like that, and that's not just in Safety Last. That's kind of in The Freshman too, which is all about him trying to fit in with the status quo of this football team and stuff. That's always kind of been his thing, is like the guy who genuinely just wants to fit in. It's also so interesting because Chaplin and Buster Keaton both, like, if you look in any film history book, they'll both get credit for, like, being huge pioneers within cinema. But Harold Lloyd is the one responsible for the first feature-length comedy in cinema.
What was that?
So everyone was just doing one-reels at the time, and the only way you could make a feature was as a drama. So Harold Lloyd and Hal Roach, who was a longtime collaborator, put together a drama called Grandma's Boy, which is kind of this guy gets thrown back in time into the Civil War with this totem from his grandmother, and it's like it was supposed to be like a very heavy drama, and it was a 4-reel film. And they showed it to a test audience. Also, Harold Lloyd was one of the first people to do test audiences. He didn't release a single film without doing a test audience. And he would sit there in the back of the theater and watch it with them and listen to their reactions. Mm-hmm. And he would always do another cut of the film after that. So Grandma's Boy, they did a screening. So people saw Harold Lloyd up there, which he was kind of known for the shorts and the one-reels at that time. And everyone was wondering where the jokes were and where the laughs were. So they pretty much that day took cameras out onto the studio, because you don't have to record sound. So they were just taking cameras out to the studio every day in the same sets and stuff while they still had them up, and just recording like little gags and little things here and there and editing them in. And so it became sort of this like drama comedy. And that's the first full-length comedy in cinema. So Safety Last is the first one that, like, from conception all the way through was, like, going to be a for-real comedy film.
Wow, so Harold Lloyd pioneered the Hollywood tradition of reshooting to appease audiences. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did you say that he's like a movie star at this point in time? I mean, he is. Everyone knows who he is.
Yeah, a lot of things started happening for Harold Lloyd, and Safety Last was a huge part of that. That was a big success. A huge success in the test screenings, too, which was funny to listen to people talk about, was that it was one of the only films they played at a test screen, and everyone just went completely gaga for it immediately. And they were ready to, like, turn it off 2 reels in if people started leaving or something, but everyone was just sitting there watching it. It's just so funny to even think about the perspective of a comedy at, what was this, like 80 minutes? 76 minutes or something?
Yeah, just about 70, 75 minutes.
And they were like, that's going to be too long. People won't want to laugh that long. You know, it's like long-form comedic plays already existed at this point. So it's just funny to think that a studio wouldn't even believe that could work.
Yeah, Hollywood is famous for, only doing what worked before and being very cautious about taking any risks after that.
Yes. Another super fascinating thing about Safety Last, this is his description of the event. He was filming a one reel. This was really close to the filming of Safety Last. And he was holding a bomb in his hand. It was supposed to be a gag. And he had this epiphany that the movie he was working on right then and this gag wasn't funny and wouldn't be funny and people wouldn't like it. And he sort of got lost in his thoughts and didn't realize that the bomb was actually loaded, and it exploded in his hand and blew off his thumb and finger.
Oh, God.
And in this film, Safety Last, he is wearing a prosthetic glove on his, I believe it's his right hand. And you can actually see, if you look, it is almost impossible to see. But if you know to look for it, there are certain moments where you can realize his other 3 fingers are moving and the other 2 are just these stationary fingers. And that makes it even more impressive, the whole, like, climbing the building thing.
I was about to say, no way.
He's doing it one-handed. He's doing it essentially one-handed and 3-fingered. Like, it's insane. And that was with him for obviously, the rest of his life. There was no reconstructive surgery or anything. He just didn't have a finger and a thumb.
What a badass. That's crazy.
Yeah, it's really cool. Can you imagine? Just like, hold this prop bomb and then just sitting there and having like an existential crisis, and then all of a sudden a bomb just explodes in your hand. Like, it just sounds horrible. The woman who plays his fiancée, the girl, Mildred Davis, had done a couple of films before that, but during this film, they actually did fall in love and get married, and she did one more film outside of his studio, and then after that never did movies again.
Did they stay married?
Yes, they did stay married.
Oh, that's great.
And this is not the first time that he had a romance with an actual co-star either. Actually, Harold Lloyd's life is very interesting because he eventually did start making films that did flop. Pretty much him and Hal Roach, that producer, they were working together a lot, and Hal Roach wanted to go back to doing one-reels and stuff like that, and Harold Lloyd wanted to keep on doing features. So they sort of had all sources say an amicable breakup. But after that, his films did see a decline in marketing and in publicity. He actually did have a talkie that was pretty successful called Welcome Danger. And one of the reasons it was so successful is because people wanted to hear his voice on film. Then he started to do films that were a little bit more political, such as The Cat's Paw or The Milky Way. He was trying to expand from just comedy into like telling deeper stories. They weren't really successful with audiences. And then it was The Sin of Harold Diddlebach, which is from 1947, and I have not seen. But that was a huge financial loss. And after that, he pretty much had no choice but to call it quits, and wouldn't release anything else until 1962 with World of Comedy. And that renewed his interest, and he started directing another film, but it never went into completion. I think that film, he had a little bit of it and did a screening for an audience, and they just did not like it at all, and so he just gave up on it.
Hmm.
He really did have the freedom to do whatever he wanted, and I think people's taste just changed. People weren't as excited by him.
It's always so sad to talk about film stars because there does seem to be this common theme of a rise and fall. When you can look this far back, you see the tragedy later in their life. I didn't know that about Harold Lloyd, but it makes sense because Charlie Chaplin went through a similar sort of thing. He was exiled from the United States for his left-leaning political views, and Buster Keaton sort of fell apart when the studios wrangled his budgets down and he couldn't do what he wanted to do anymore. So it's always a little sad, but it seems to be such a common theme for these big film stars.
Especially of that time. I feel like culture has like sort of started taking the side of the celebrity to a certain that they definitely don't feel as expendable now, but maybe that's just my perspective. I definitely think that people saw movies as sort of an alien form to a certain extent, and sort of saw the people in them as just these like, you know, I mean, people at the time weren't even really thinking about the fact that, oh, they actually jumped on a train, they actually jumped on a building, you know, they were just sort of laughing. That sort of came with film analysis and film history, the whole idea of watching a silent film and thinking, gosh, they like actually were on that horse and like just drove it right off the side of a train track, you know? Yeah, his life, he had like a big family that he ended up being responsible for, and he felt really good about that. He was known as being a good family man, and then he was 77, and he got told that he had prostate cancer and he had 6 months to live. And I think it was like three weeks, and he just died in his sleep. He was just, and like everyone said that he would always be someone to fight and like would always be someone to push back. But like when it came to hearing that diagnosis, he was like, okay, it's over.
My time has come.
Yeah, and like just died in his sleep. I feel like an iconic image from silent film for so many people is Charlie Chaplin being churned through those gears in modern times. But these days, I've seen that image of Harold Lloyd hanging off the clock hand so many times, and it just seems to be it's weird how icons and images as far as preserving history work. I think there's even like a teaser thing back in the olden days when we went to the movie theaters. I feel like there's this montage of film clips that like play before every movie, and they're like, remember movies? It's like so silly.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
the only silent film present in it is Safety Last. You just see him hanging off the clock for a second. And I remember seeing that in a theater. I can't remember what I was seeing, but that they played that right before it, and I was like, huh, kind of crazy that Safety Last is the silent film, because Safety Last wasn't even really that well discussed as far as silent films went. I mean, I could even just 10, 15 years ago. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And so it's just interesting how ever since it's gotten this new restoration, it's been re-released, there have been theatrical screenings of it, and now it sort of has become this iconic silent film. I can't help but feel like the future of film history is going to be very kind to Harold Lloyd, and I think that people will see him as sort of an underdog of those three.
So next week we're watching The Thief of Baghdad from 1924. This is a film that you can find on Amazon Prime, but you shouldn't, because what Amazon Prime is streaming is just of a terrible quality. I found it on YouTube since it's a public domain film, and you should too.
Talk to y'all next week. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to say goodbye, and then I'll see you in 7 days, man.
Well, we've been having a great time going through and watching all these movies. Hopefully you are too, even if you're just listening. If you are enjoying this podcast and you would like to support us, go ahead and give us a rating and a nice review, and that will help get the show out there. It'd be much appreciated.
And a big thank you to Nathan Royal for our intro and outro.
Thanks so much for listening, and there will be a new episode next week.
I just want to give a shout out to all our Patreon members who keep the show running. Thank you all. You too can become a patron and get access to bonus episodes linked down in the show notes. You're listening on YouTube now, so like and subscribe and comment down below. Tell us if you've seen the film. What did you think of it? Did we miss anything? Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you for the next one.